One of the most sought after but most difficult skills to acquire on the piano is sight reading. And that's because it's difficult to know exactly how you should be sight reading in order to improve. So in today's video, I'm going to explain how you can find the right level of music to sight read. I'm going to talk about the 3 elements that make up sight reading, what to do before you start playing, what to do while you're playing, what to do after you've finished sight reading, and I'm also going to explain how to measure if you are actually improving at sight reading. So let's get into it. So firstly, what is sight reading? Well, as I have mentioned in many of my videos, I like to distinguish sight reading from reading. Sight reading is your instant recognition of notes. It's your ability to play a piece of music that you have never seen before. And regular reading is where you take a piece of music and you learn it over a much longer period of time, and you dissect the music, you try and understand exactly what is happening in that piece of music, and you perfect the way that you're going to play it. Having said this, your ability to sight read does directly affect your ability to learn a piece of music and read the piece of music. If you are able to instantly recognize the notes on the page and all of the details on the page, then it's going to take you much less time even when you're learning a piece of music in depth. So how do you actually find the right level of material in order to be able to help you learn to sight read? Well, if you are an absolute beginner, then I recommend my own sight reading book, which has 420 exercises for you to start practicing sight reading from the very beginning. The exercises in my book get progressively more difficult so that you naturally start seeing harder and harder material and start improving that way. However, if you are not an absolute beginner and you're trying to find some sight reading material that is the right level for you, then the way that I would think about this is by replicating an idea that is taken from language learning. And it's a theory called comprehensible input by someone called Stephen Krashen. And the theory is that in order to be able to acquire a language, you need to be able to understand most of what you are looking at. If you can play and understand 95% of the music that you are reading, but then you trip up once, or there is a note that you have to spend a bit more time working out, then that is the perfect level. And Stephen Krashen refers to this as I+1, which is the level that you're at plus 1, so plus a little bit of difficulty. So very slightly above the level that you are currently at. The reason for this is because if the material you're trying to read is too difficult, then there's going to be lots of mistakes that you're making throughout that piece of music, and it's going to be very difficult to learn from all of those mistakes. So you're much better off playing correctly and reinforcing what you can already do, and then being able to take in the one thing that you couldn't do in that piece of music. However, you also don't want a piece of music that is way too easy, where you don't have to think very hard. For example, if you're a grade 8 pianist and you're playing 5 notes in one hand, then that's going to be far too easy for you. The best advice I have for trying to find sheet music that is about the right sight reading level for you is to use the graded system to work out what kind of level you are at. Typically, your sight reading level will probably be around 2 grades lower than the type of piece that you're learning. So if you are playing a piece of music right now that is around grade 6 standard, for example, then the ideal sight reading level of piece will probably be around grade 4 standard. However, that's not always the case, and you may find those pieces too difficult. So you can adjust to maybe grade 3 pieces to find that sweet spot where you can understand most of what you're looking at the first time you see it, but you make 1 or 2 mistakes throughout the piece. Having said that, you will improve no matter what material you're reading, even if it is slightly too difficult or slightly too easy, as long as you do it consistently over time. So what is considered a mistake, and what are the elements that make up sight reading? Well, there are 3 things to consider when you are sight reading. There are the notes, there is the rhythm, and there is the character of the piece that you're playing. And just to define in a piece of music what these things actually are, the notes would be the exact keys that you're pressing. The rhythm is the note lengths and the time signature and the pulse of the piece of music. And the character is the things like the dynamics, so the volume that you're playing, the tempo, so the speed that you're playing, the articulation, so are the notes staccato or legato? Are they short and spiky? Or are they smooth and connected? Now, for the most part, when people are trying to sight read, they prioritize these 3 elements in that order, which is the notes first, then the rhythm, and then the character of the piece. However, in order to get good at sight reading, you actually need to reverse this order and do it in the exact opposite way. So consider the character of the piece of music first, then worry about the rhythm and keeping the music flowing, and then worry about getting the exact notes correct, which is actually quite hard to do because naturally, obviously, we want to play the correct notes. The reason that you should prioritize these things in that order, character, rhythm, then notes, is because in a real life situation, let's say, for example, a singer comes to you and they give you a piece of music to accompany them. The most important thing to do in that situation is, firstly, sell the piece of music to the audience. It would be very obvious that you are struggling to sight read the piece of music if it just sounded all the same dynamic and it had no no character at all. Then you've got to prioritize the rhythm because you need to keep the flow of the music going, especially if you are accompanying someone. They're not going to stop for you, so you have to keep going no matter what. You can't stop and start again. And once again, that will be a real giveaway that you're struggling to sight read the piece of music. And then finally, prioritizing the notes. The best you can, you want to play exactly what's on the page. However, if you understand the theory behind the music, you can generally make up quite a lot of the music so that people won't notice that you're not reading exactly what's on the page. So even as an absolute beginner who doesn't understand exactly what's on the page or how to make something up to sound like it's what's on the page, it's much better to start prioritizing the character, then the rhythm, and then the notes, just so you get into the habit of making pieces of music sound like the genre they're supposed to be, and you get used to carrying on no matter what. So what should you do before you start playing? There are several things that you should look at before you start actually playing the piece of music. The first of which is the key signature. That's going to tell you which scale that piece of music is using, and therefore if you have practiced your scales, you'll know which notes you're going to generally be using on the piano. The second of which is the time signature, and that tells you how many beats there are in a bar, so you'll know how to count the piece of music. Then you need to look at any performance markings, so any words on the page that tell you how to characterize the piece of music. For example, if it says dolce, then that means sweet. So that tells you something about how to play this piece. There is also tempo markings, which tell you the speed of the piece of music. That also tells you something about how to characterize the piece of music and how it's supposed to feel. Then you need to look at the dynamics for the entire piece to kind of get a general idea of what is supposed to happen throughout the piece. Is the piece mostly piano and therefore soft, but then there is this one section that's suddenly loud? Or is the music constantly changing in dynamic and therefore feeling more turbulent? And lastly, I would look at any specific articulation that is in that piece. For example, is there a section that is mostly staccato and therefore really short and spiky? Does the piece of music have long phrase marks, so therefore you want to connect those notes throughout that section? Once you've made a mental note of all of these things that are happening in the piece of music, that should give you a good idea of the type of piece that this is going to sound like. And if you are someone who has played the piano for quite a long time and therefore slightly more advanced, you should also look at whether the piece is in the major or the minor key from the key signature. You should look at if there is any key changes or modulations throughout the piece of music. So does it change to a different scale at any point? And also generally what chords are being used and how are they voiced throughout the piece of music? Because this will also tell you a lot about the character of the piece of music. And this is all very quickly in your head before you've played a single note on the piano. So here's what you should do while you are playing the piece of music. If you are a beginner to sight reading, then there are two ways in which I would practice sight reading. First of all, I would practice saying the note names out loud, because any sight reading material that's up to around grade 1 generally is in one hand position on the piano, so it will be 5 different notes with 5 different fingers. And when you are trying to sight read, it's very easy for that to become a game of saying this note is 1 up from the previous note, and then this note is 1 down from the previous note, and then you associate that with which finger you're playing on the piano rather than what the note actually is. So if you are saying the note name as you're playing it, you're associating the note on the page with the actual note name and the note on the piano with the note name. The second way in which beginners can practice sight reading is by counting out loud. Now, similarly, a lot of the time you can end up guessing how long notes are supposed to be if you don't actually count them. So by counting out loud, you're reinforcing your idea of note lengths and how long they are and where they sit in the bar that they're in. Having said that, I would still only play each exercise only once, but for some exercises, I would say the note name, and for other exercises, I would count. And if you are a more advanced player and play in slightly more challenging music as sight reading material, then what you should be trying to do is trying not to read any individual note and try and read it as part of its context. And by this, I mean try and read the bar as the chord that it outlines, for example, or try and read a melodic line as a series of chord notes with passing notes in between or auxiliary notes that come outside of those chord notes. As music gets progressively more difficult, you are much more reliant on larger patterns when you're sight reading. It no longer becomes possible to really read the individual notes, especially if you've got chords that are 6 notes at a time. You're not going to read all 6 of these notes individually. You're going to see that entire thing as an E major chord, for example. So for more advanced players, this is the thing that you're going to need to try and recognize. So what should you do after you've played in order to improve? Well, what you should do is work out exactly what was difficult about the sight reading piece that you just played. For example, did you forget to put the dynamics in the piece of music? Was there a particular note that was a big jump away from the previous note and therefore you found it more difficult to read? Was there a particular chord where it was hard to work out what that chord was? And why was it hard to work out? If you can work out what the thing was that made it difficult for you, then you can make a conscious mental note of that. So if you see that same thing again, you have a much better chance of recognizing it in future. So here are two pieces which I'm going to walk you through how I would approach sight reading them. The first one is going to be for beginners from my sight reading book, and the second one will be more of a challenging piece for those that can already kind of instantly recognize individual notes. So here is an exercise from my sight reading book which is of around grade 1 sight reading level. So the first thing to note is the key signature, and here it has no key signature, so that means it's in C major, and that means it uses a C major scale, which is just the white notes. The time signature here is 3/4, which means there are 3 quarter notes or 3 crotchets in each of the bars, which means I'm going to be counting to 3. There is a performance marking here which says minuet, and minuet is actually a type of dance, so that means that this piece is going to feel slightly more dancey. Then in the first half of this piece of music, it's piano, which means softly, and in the second half of this piece of music, it's mezzo forte, which means kind of moderately loud. There are phrase marks under the first 2 bars and on the 3rd and 4th bar as well, which means that these sections want to be grouped, and it doesn't want to be short and detached. It wants to be more singing. Fortunately, at this level, there is no speed marking in this case, so we can play this at whatever speed is comfortable. And for this exercise, I'm going to count out loud just to make sure I get the rhythms correct. So that will be something like this. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now, once I played it, obviously I played that correctly. However, if I didn't play something correctly, I could work out why I didn't play it correctly, what was difficult about it. Or in this case, I played it correctly, but there may have been something that felt slightly uncomfortable or that I had a slight mental panic about. For example, it might have been when I switched from the right hand to the left hand that I found more challenging. And therefore, in the next exercise, I'll be more conscious of trying to make sure I'm mentally prepared for that. Okay, here is Beethoven's Sonata in G major, and I'm just going to do the first 4 bars of this piece as an exercise. So here there is actually a lot more notes going on, and for someone who can read these notes individually quite well but finds it hard to sight read this piece because they're happening too fast, here's how I would approach this. So firstly, we need to go through all of the same things. So the key signature is G major, it has 1 sharp, or it could be E minor because E minor also has 1 sharp. The time signature here is cut time, and we can see this because it's a C with a line through it, and this means that it's 2/2. And 2/2 means that there are 2 half notes or 2 minims per bar. This means that the pulse is going to feel like there's 2 beats in the bar. The performance markings here says allegro ma non troppo, which means fast but not too much. So that tells us that this is going to be more of a lively piece. And here there are no dynamics, which is interesting. However, the first chord in the piece is a G major chord, and we can see that because it's the notes G, B, and D, which makes a G major chord. So therefore, this piece is in G major rather than E minor, and that means it's probably going to sound kind of bright. And if the piece of music is going to sound more bright, then it's probably not going to be really soft and insecure. It's probably going to be a little bit more moderate in dynamic. So interestingly, for me, before I even start playing this piece, I'm already looking through the piece and working out kind of how this is going to sound based on the chords that are being used and also how the melody is moving up and down. So for example, in the first bar, we have that G major chord, but then the next set of notes are essentially outlining a G major chord. And then it's outlining a D7 chord before going to G again. Then you get a G chord, a D chord, a G chord, a D chord, and then a G chord, a G7, it changes to C major temporarily before playing a D7 chord, which lands on G, and that is a perfect cadence at the end of that phrase. So as you can see, I'm not really reading the individual notes when I'm playing through this piece of music in my head. I'm thinking more about the chords, how that shapes the piece of music, also what's happening in the melody and the way it rises and falls. So if I was sight reading this, I would probably play something like this. And once again, for the most part, I did play that correctly. However, there were some things that if I was sight reading in future, I'd want to pay particular attention to. One of which is that trill that's in the last bar. That's slightly more difficult to include when you are sight reading, so I will make a mental note to pay particular attention to that the next time I come across a trill in sight reading. And I also think I could have been more expressive with the way that I played the piece, so next time I'll also make sure to maybe expand my dynamic range more. The important thing to know about sight reading is that it's very difficult to see progress from day to day. Unlike learning a piece of music where at the start of a practice session and at the end of a practice session you can see improvement. With sight reading, because you are trying to teach your brain to see new material that you've never seen before in a different way, on a day-to-day basis, you are probably not going to feel like you're making much progress. So how do you actually know and measure your progress? Well, the best way to do this is to make sure that you are practicing sight reading every time you practice the piano. So spend 10 minutes reading some music that you've never seen before. And really, what you're trying to do is practice your methodology of sight reading. It's not a case of just sitting down and playing the notes on the page. It's training your brain to go through the process of working out what exactly is happening in that piece of music, and trying to learn from the mistakes that you make. So in order to be able to actually improve that, you need to be sight reading pretty consistently over a longer period of time. And then in order to measure progress, I would pick a piece that you are sight reading today, and then in a month or 2 months time, I would try and sight read that piece of music again once you're sight reading things that are slightly more challenging. Because you are only reading a piece of music once when you're sight reading it, the likelihood is that after a month or two, you will have forgotten that piece of music, so you will be able to sight read it again. However, this time you will notice that it is much easier to sight read. And that is because if you are practicing sight reading correctly, all of the things in that piece of music that you were making mistakes on before, you will now not be making mistakes on. And because of this, another way in order to be able to measure your progress sight reading is to record yourself sight reading. If you record yourself playing a piece of music today and you see the mistakes that you're making, in several months' time, if you look back at that recording, you'll notice that the type of thing that you were struggling on before is much easier than the types of things that you're struggling on now. Let me know in the comments which things you are finding the most difficult in a piece of music when you are sight reading. And if you want to see me answering my subscribers' most burning questions, such as, is pop music enough to make you a great pianist, then head on through and I will see you there.